All right, welcome to the sixth workshop now on the return to Freud. In this workshop on the Freudian Unconscious, we're going to be covering two papers, one from 1906 and one from 1907. They're thematically aligned. The first one is titled My Views on the Part Played by Sexuality in the Aetiology of Neuroses. This is a paper that Freud wrote, which is sort of both informing the public about his discoveries in psychoanalysis and attempting to update his theory given the deepening of his experience after about 15 years of investigating the neuroses and specifically developing his theory of what causes the neuroses. I think it's a great example and a demonstration of the evolution of Freud's own theoretical understanding and the way by which he goes about developing his theoretical understanding. The second paper is titled On the Sexual Enlightenment of Children, and this is more Freud's personal view on how the discoveries of psychoanalysis should be translated into sexual education. So both of these papers, I think, are going to be informative and helpful in helping us engage in dialogue about the way we understand sexuality today. So lots of interesting things to dive into, I think. So I'm gonna share my screen and start the first presentation. You see there the sexual neuroses and enlightenment. Let me see if I can go full screen. Maybe that's good. Anyway, that's good. Okay, so first paper, my view on the part played by sexuality in the etiology of the neuroses. So Freud starts the paper by basically saying, the cornerstone of my theory is that sex is the cause, the primary cause of mental disease or neuroses, and that it's not that before this theory, sexuality was unknown or hypothesized to play no role in mental disease or neuroses, but for analysis, Freud really wants to emphasize that sexuality is central, sexuality is primary in the causing of mental diseases, and that other phenomena are kind of epiphenomenal or secondary to the mental disease. So basically what psychoanalysis is saying is that when we analyze our psyche, the psyche cannot be understood independently or disconnected from libidinal body. So in contemporary jargon, when people say embodied consciousness, like contemporary science will say embodied consciousness, in Freudian language, what they're stumbling upon is the libidinal body and the fact that you cannot understand the psyche independent of the libidinal body. That's the first point Freud wants to make. It's the central point. Now, Freud also says that how analysis has gone about discovering this is through one, he says, the skillful pursuit of truth. And that means basically, I have a method. I developed a method and I was interested in the truth and nothing except but the truth. So and in that regard, this method was applied towards overcoming denial mechanisms of the ego. So in the discovery, in the development of the theory, there were many resistances, both internally and in patients. But it was in overcoming egoic denial, overcoming defense mechanisms, which allowed the uncovering of new knowledge about the psyche and its relationship with the body. So he claims that in the development of this theory, he juxtaposes it against theoreticians, and I think that this is a jab at philosophers in particular, who develop complete ontologies out of nowhere. So you'll see this very often in I think, poor philosophy and in the sciences more and more, where basically theorists develop ontologies which never change. They develop their own personal ontology, and it's complete, it's static, it's fixed, just developing out of nowhere. Whereas Freud's saying all of my theory, all of my ontology has been a continuous progress, a continuous development that is constantly being informed by, quote, ever deepening experience. So in other words, Freud's language and Freud's theoretical developments are always in touch with experience. It's always in a loop with experience. And it's always subject to change, always subject to renegotiation, depending on the phenomena which it's in touch with, depending on the phenomena which it's in contact with. The other main point at the beginning of the paper is that Freud sort of reasserts or reaffirms the two main neuroses which caught his attention in the first papers we studied back in the first, second, and third workshops. Mainly, on the one hand, you have these sexuated neuroses. So in the paper, he calls it neurasthenia, which is likened to the obsessional neuroses, what he calls obsessional excitations, and presents it in formulations of, even says explicitly, excessive masturbation, but of course in the sublimation of the symptom, this obsessional excitation can manifest itself beyond just the excessive masturbation, but excessive attachment to non-sexual ideas. And then the other neurotic predisposition is the anxiety neuroses, which he now labels as unconsummated excitation and is more of a feminine expression. And this would be located on closer edge of the hysterical neuroses. So you have the obsessional neuroses, the hysterical neuroses, and this is in some sense a summary of things that we've already discussed in the first workshops, but he's sort of here reassessing. These are the central points of his theory. Now he's going to go into talking about the theoretical modifications that he wants to introduce due to the ever deepening experience. So again, he's not against fundamentally revising his theory depending on the methods he's using and the experience that he's in touch with and discovering something new. So in terms of method, he wants to emphasize, and we covered this in the last workshop as well, that there's a transition from the hypnotic method, which he practices with Joseph Breuer, to the cathartic method, and that in the transition from the hypnotic method, which is more based on suggestion and overcomes ego defenses more easily, to the cathartic method where you have to work through the ego defenses and work through all of the little mechanisms that the ego is going to put up to defend itself against the truth. Basically, he was pushed further and further to the idea that the symptoms, the neurotic symptoms, were derived from a patient's childhood and sexual life. So basically, the unconscious mind in the early years of our development, we are alive, of course, and we are we have a psyche, but we're not conscious in the way that we're conscious as adults. And yet this early state of consciousness or pre-consciousness or unconsciousness is the ground upon which our ego emerges. Our ego emerges from this early state of consciousness, or early state of unconsciousness is probably the better way to say it. So the theoretical modification he wants to make, and he wants to make two theoretical modifications. The first one on this slide is the distinction between, in the early theory, he thought basically that early childhood sexual experiences very broadly defined, determine the future direction of sexual life. The theoretical correction he wants to make is that it's more that pubertal fantasies are built out of childhood memories. I think this is an ingenious distinction. So I want to go into a little bit what he's saying here. It's a transition from infantile sexual traumas to the infantilism of sexuality itself. So what that means is that our early infantile childhood memories, which are sexual memories, like, for example, suckling on a mother's breast, or early intimate affection, that these memories, these unconscious memories, are the material, the material of the unconscious, where the subject will build its sexual fantasies during puberty. And this building up of the pubertal fantasies become the adult structure of the ego. But this adult structure of the ego, you see, is built out of infantile sexuality. So this is, this to me is a genius observation and a genius distinction, because if you look at the material of the adult sexuality, it is, it is infantile. That's why, for example, husbands and wives can reenact their infantile attachment patterns with their intimate partner. Like a husband turning his wife into a mother is a common thing that people will observe. So this is sort of why, this is the deep reason why. Okay, so the second theoretical correction he wants to introduce is that in his early theory, he was prone to the idea that accidental sexual impressions that either have a passive nature or an active nature determine the, quote, choice of neuroses. So, for example, hysteria was linked to passive and obsessional was linked to active. And again, Freud's saying this is too deterministic. And the theoretical correction he wants to make is that it's not so much the event in itself of the passive or active distinction, but rather the way in which the ego, or rather, let me say, the way in which the subject uses the ego to defend itself against the active or passive event. So it's more the mode of repression. It's the mode of the way the subject is dealing with, quote unquote, intolerable emotion. So in the construction of the ego, is the ego building itself up out of denial or acceptance of difficult emotion? And for Freud, this is the crucial distinction. So on the one hand, you have the idea that our sexuality, our adult sexuality, our fantasies are built out of infantile memories. And on the other hand, you have the idea that the main cause of the neuroses is the way in which the ego accepted or denied intolerable emotion. So if there's a very strong denial of intolerable emotion, this is a huge ego defense. Whereas if there's a strong, if there's an acceptance of intolerable emotion, there's less of a neurotic disposition. So again, emphasizing the double correction. On the one hand, the infantilism of sexual fantasies, this hypnotic sort of consciousness that we get in our sexual consciousness, stemming from our childhood memories. On the other hand, the ego defense and the repression as the main source of the neuroses, and basically therefore defines neurotic illness as both the failure of defense. This is why it's impossible for a Freudian to think that the ego is strong, or to think that it's a good thing to have a strong ego, because for Freud, the ego's strength is its failure. That when the ego tries to defend itself, it just ends up in a neurotic state. It just ends up a mess. It ends up at a distance from truth. So it's more about the failure to sublimate the infantile attachment and experience into a more mature adult form, which is not necessarily about having a strong ego, but more about accepting the nature of the body, the psyche's acceptance of what it is. I think that's really important. And then another point that's important to emphasize, it's more, and this is against people who think Freud is a determinist, or thinking Freud is too much reducing us to the past, because I think on close analysis, it's impossible to say Freud is reducing us to the past. And this point here especially emphasizes it, which is that it's more the reaction to events than events in themselves. So this is connected to the ego defense and the repression mechanism. So it's more the mode of which the subject is reacting to events. So he says that on the obsessional end, the obsessional neurotic starts to emerge strongly when the subject is faced with the real demands of life. So this is basically the reality principle. When the subject is faced with the real demands of life, these obsessional compulsions will emerge because the subject feels it's at a distance from the state of consciousness which it desires to be in, which is, again, this infantile state with the mother, this infantile state in unconditional love, and sort of this building up of sexual fantasies will emerge in the gap. And again, those building up of sexual fantasies will be a recreation. They'll be infantile. They'll be a recreation of those infantile experiences. Whereas the hysteric is more a type of neurosis that emerges in the conflict between libido and repression as a compromise formation. So in other words, and again, that's more on the feminine end. And you can see why that there's basically the repression that I am sexual at all. And this is a totally different sort of psychic structure here. And again, I think both these structures, and I think that there's a good continuity here in Freud's theory in identifying the sexuation at play in the neuroses. That's a constant in his work. It's a constant in the development of these theories. So now, as it regards sexuality in itself, childhood sexuality in itself, and these distinctions here, these are all new in our workshop. This slide here summarizes, in some sense, the types of ideas that Freud explores in his 3 essays on sexuality, which is a book from 1905, which, if you haven't read it, read it. We're not covering the books in these workshops, so it's important to also read those on your own time if you're so inclined. The most important point is that Freud's saying here that as it regards childhood sexuality as it exists in and for itself, that it is existing as a polymorphous perversity. In other words, he's saying it's more diverse, the word he uses, variegated than expected, and that normal sexual function, quote unquote, with normal sexual function being defined as the primacy of the genital zones being put into the service of reproduction, that only emerges after repression. That only emerges during the genital phase of maturation. But before that phase, childhood sexuality is just polymorphous perverse, meaning that the child gets sexual enjoyment from the oral phase. The child gets sexual enjoyment from the anal phase. The child gets sexual enjoyment from skin. In other words, the child's whole body is a libidinal body. Then in the genital phase, everything gets concentrated in the genitals. And this concentration in the genitals is then put into the social, ethical dimension of reproducing. And this, of course, reflects the normative pattern of civilizational development. And here you get a bifurcation, a new bifurcation, which is super important to think about, which is the bifurcation between perversion and neuroses. So Freud starts out his analysis concerned with the neuroses. And here he's saying that what the neuroses are is excessive repression. So basically, the fact that all of our libidinal energy gets concentrated in the genitals, and the fact that that genital energy has to be put into the service of reproduction, leads to excessive repression or negation of all the other possible expressions of our sexual energy. And in that sense, we can have mental disturbances when that goes too far, or when that isn't consciously thought through with the nuance and the perhaps say enlightenment that it requires. Whereas he defines perversion as the opposite of neuroses, and perversion is a quote unquote disturbance of normality. Here, disturbance of normality vis-a-vis primacy of genital zones in the service of reproduction. This disturbance of normality in an overpowering compulsive instinct. So you can see here that in Freud's time, the problem was the excessive repression, the neuroses. Now I would say in our current time, I would say it's flipped into the opposite, that now we have the widespread tolerance of perversion. And so you can see the historical conditioning of this axis of the neuroses and the perversion vis-a-vis normality or genital zones in service of reproduction. There's an important sexual dialectic that is emerging here in Freud, which I still think we need to think more deeply, because the historicization of the theory itself is important. So now I want to emphasize in this final point that I think Freud doesn't spend enough time, although he emphasizes it. He says sexual problems are a combination of quote unquote constitutional factors and ego defense. So he doesn't spend enough time on constitutional factors, in my view, because when you go into the constitutional factors, what he's basically emphasizing is what the contemporary incels are emphasizing. Because the constitutional factors are your basic physiological, physical factors that go into the expression of your sexual energy. And then the ego defense is the acceptance or the denial of your sexual state. And that the neurotic symptoms emerge here in the problems of your constitutional factor and your ego defense as it relates to the expression of your sexual energy. So I think it's important that we frame sexual problems in this way, that constitutional factors play an important role, and basically your mode of ego defense plays an important role in the form of your symptom. And then this is the last slide, where he's basically summarizing here his view of sexuality as it is in 1906. Is basically saying that what the psychoneuroses are disturbances of sexual process. So if we understand sexuality as a process, the formation of it and the utilization of it, anything that causes a disturbance to the process is where the neuroses emerge. And that the disturbances are multi-causal and related to the constitution of the body. And this is, to me, here, the highlight of the paper is that he ends the paper by concluding, and this is totally a demonstration of his fidelity to the truth, which is that in the 1890s, he was making a distinction between neurotic patients and healthy people. And here he's ending the paper by saying, it's not possible to differentiate between neurotic and healthy people. There are no healthy people. There's just differences in neurotic disposition. And the reason why is because there's no such thing as a perfect sexual process. This is such a crucial point and a demonstration of how Freud is faithful to his own project and the truth. Meaning the primary distinction he was using in the 1890s totally falls away. There are no more healthy people. There's just different forms of neuroses. And some neuroses are more extreme, meaning that some people have had an extremely disturbed sexual process, And some people are less extreme, meaning some people's sexual process has undergone less disturbance, meaning that the formation of their sexuality and the utilization of their sexuality has, in some sense, reached, maybe you could say, balance, harmonious balance of some kind, but it's in the end still impossible to say it's perfect or perfectly healthy. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I will say, let's see, someone new's joining, but I just say that I think this paper is fantastic because it shows Freud's willingness to historicize his own theoretical development. It shows his capacity to critique his own observations and to update his theory in relationship to new experience. And I think that in doing that, he actually pushes towards super rich innovations in the way we think about sexuality. So I say, for me, how I relate to the crucial distinctions he introduces in this paper is that when I look at the genital fantasies that emerged in puberty for me, and I see the ground upon which those fantasies were built, and the way in which those fantasies end up becoming central to my adult ego, it's so obvious that my sexuality is infantile. It's so obvious that my fantasies are trying to recreate some hypnotic early state that reflects my first experiences. And then the second crucial point of that the main aspect is not the event in itself of the disturbance, but the way my ego reacts to disturbance. In other words, the way my ego takes difficult emotion and either denies it, tries to prevent it from reaching consciousness and thinking about it, or accepting it and talking about it as the healthiest possible way to deal with our situation. So it's incredibly rich, I think. But please feel free to. Yeah, Dimitri, please.
To say. Yeah, no, I love that he emphasizes that it's the reaction to the disturbance, which you didn't. I wanted to push back on you, but you, because you said it was like the disturbance and how big it is. But some people have the hugest disturbances ever, but they will never look at themselves like a victim or something like that. Whereas other people would very quickly do that. So and it's then the question is, so where does this come from? This reaction, is it genetic? But it's some interesting place of. But I wanted to ask a question of. He says at a certain point that neuroses is the negative of perversion. So I would like to know, what is perversion, and yeah, how does that make sense?
Yeah, so let me maybe share my slide again, because I covered that on the second last slide. Let me show it again. So you can see here, this is, and Dimitri, I recommend you read the 3 essays on sexuality, because this slide here covers his book, the three essays on sexuality, which is basically, he's defining here a new system, which is, you see, normality, perversion, and neuroses. The crucial thing is that the neuroses and the perversion are opposites of each other. So the neuroses are the excessive repression, and the perversion is the sort of the repetitive compulsive instinct, which is outside the genital zone in service of reproduction. So basically, any sexual energy which is not serving reproduction is perverse for Freud. Anything that deviates from the norm of putting genital energy in service of reproduction is a perversion. And the neuroses, Freud would say, the neuroses are in somewhat are somewhat necessary to stabilize normality. In other words, if you're going to have the entire society putting all of their genital energy towards reproduction, and that's the norm, then you can only do that through neuroses. You can only do that through repression. It doesn't have to be excessive repression, but some form of repression, some form of negation of the inherent truth or nature of the sexual energy. That's not to say that Freud is arguing that we should all just become perverts. He's not saying one or the other. He's not saying we should do one thing or the other. He's just identifying these two extremes.
So where can you see that in this society today?
See what?
The perversion that it's.
Well, I think most
problem.
of our sexuality I don't know. I can't quantify it, obviously. But like, for example, if you look at, for example, the Tinder generation or OnlyFans or pornography or all of that is perverse.
But isn't it genital?
Well, it's genital, but it's not in service of reproduction.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm just gonna go on Pornhub and just enjoy my genital zones, and it has gonna have nothing at all to do with building a family and reproducing. It's just my personal perverse enjoyment.
Well, I am not an expert, but I would like to maybe challenge a bit you on this point, since I don't think that we are maybe it's not too fair to say that we are living in a state of perversion, whereas in Freud's time the problem was just excessive repression.
Yeah, sure. Challenge.
Yeah. I think that it's one of those commonplace criticisms of Freud, as I've listed them before. That's in his so-called Victorian era, people were so reserved and so on. I mean, I think this is just fantasy, which is produced for our view from television shows and so on. But
so how would you describe it?
Yeah, really, I think that going straight to the point, I think that the mainstream of ideology today is best discerned by Zizek, and his kind of analysis of the way that we relate to culture today is it's sort of this perfect product, which is some kind of like coffee without the excessive elements of caffeine. It's this butter without causing you to clog your veins. It's this kind of like a perfect product would be some kind of like candy bar, which causes you to be more healthy. So in a way, there is a problem of enjoyment, but I don't think that it's really evidence of perversion being the mainstream ideology today. Even if we are really indulged in sexual enjoyment in our popular culture and so on, since every time there is an occasion of this kind of fascination with sexual enjoyment or kind of problematic relation to bodily enjoyment through products, it's always kind of like deprived of some kind of malevolent elements. And the one kind of criticism would be that the real consumer today, the real consumer today would be a kind of a drug addict or a chain smoker or somebody who really is a disturbing figure, something that needs to be sort of pushed away from the view of the public. So I think that it's really it's an erotic situation more than ever. I think that we are more neurotic than anyone ever had, any creature on universe that have ever existed. There have never been more neurotic figures than we today. Since, well, the joke is that we try to proliferate enjoyment and desire, cause it to be free, but this causes us to be more neurotic. I mean, have you ever been around like addicts or some kind of like drinkers? They're really neurotic. They're completely obsessed by some kind of trying to come up with a way to cope with their own enjoyments.
Yeah, I think when I say that we live in a more perverse society now, I'm not saying that the perversion is like, I think the perversion is seen as a problem by perverts themselves. Like, but I think what you're saying about, like, I think what you're saying about you know, the candy bar, you know, having a chocolate bar that's healthy, for example. You know, like this type of thing. I think that emerges in, like, in sexuality days, like you can have sex without heartbreak, or you can have sex without any of the messiness. You can have,
is it this exactly the fantasy behind Tinders and every kind of sexual horrors?
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that it's more neurotic situation than ever.
Well, it's weird here, like, because if Freud's saying if I'm just going based on what he says in the paper, where he's saying that neuroses is to basically put sexual energy in service of reproduction primarily and almost exclusively, whereas perversion is the opposite of that. Whereas perversion is sexual energy that is repeating itself outside of that normal model.
Yeah.
Do you disagree with that distinction?
No, but really, what's reproduction here? I mean, Freud is some type of naturalist, but reproduction in what sense? It is the repetition what we need to really think about when we think of reproduction. I mean, the neurotic situation tries to always reproduce the same.
Yes,
way.
but the perversion is also a repetition compulsion. So maybe are you critiquing Freud's distinctions of neuroses and perversion?
No, but okay. I think that we need to be more metaphysical about these ideas. But yeah, not to get lost, I think that these papers are really like dense, and I mean there are not too many pages there, but it's so much material that we could talk about.
Yes,
I don't want to get stuck too much on this point.
It's a good, but I think it's important. But
I think that the thing is like what is very neurotic or not very neurotic. I think Zizek or myself or Cadell, whatever, like doing philosophy is so neurotic. Like, what the hell are you doing? Sitting in your room, going through all these, information, getting to the truth, failing in it. Like, that's so neurotic. So yeah, what is very neurotic or not very neurotic? And I mean, like, this is maybe where we get stuck on if we are in this, perverse and neurosis, and yeah.
I think Mika. Sorry, I think Mika is right about repressive desublimation, the paradoxical result of permissiveness.
Yes,
that Zizek points out.
Absolutely. I think. Everin.
I also have a question. I mean, doesn't Freud at the same time claim that even the most normal sexual relation involve perversion inside it? So if it is so, how can neurotic sexuality be possible if sexuality is inherently something perverted? This is my question.
Yeah. So Freud's basically saying that all children are polymorphous perverse. That's the ground upon which our consciousness emerges. And that neurosis emerges as a reaction to the genital phase of our puberty. So it's about taking this polymorphous perverse energy and channeling it in a single direction, which is in service of quote unquote normality, which is in service of quote unquote basically having two opposite sex adults reproduce and build a family. And then that's the foundation of society. And in order to do that, you need neurosis, or you need negation of polymorphous perversity. That's and I agree with Ishik, and I agree with Mika when they say in our current culture, like I think, and this is going to be evident in the next paper, because in the next paper, Freud's complaining about prudishness. He's complaining that people are prudes about sexuality. Today, I think we're permissive about sexuality. So we've gone from prudishness to permissiveness. And I think that's, to me, that's what I mean when I say we've gone from primarily a neurotic disposition to primarily a perverse disposition. Because the permissiveness is we're permissive about perversion. And the prudishness was against perversion. So I mean, I think that really shows up clearly in the next paper too. And the way Freud critiques the prudish people is, I think Zizek is someone who has the opposite view. It's not the prudes that are the problem, but the permissive people that are the problem.
But isn't it also the case that sexual education still sucks?
Yes, it totally. Well, this is why it's going to be so interesting to analyze the next paper.
Yeah. I mean, it's the endless wealth of like material for comedians. The way that sexual education is formed. I mean, something that came to my mind when reading this is just a really simple question. Why the fuck do we have such a problematic relation in teaching about this to children? I mean, what the fuck?
I think to me the paradox is obviously that adults need to teach the children, but the adults are the ones suffering. The children aren't suffering yet. The adults are suffering. So how can they teach? How can they teach it? Because it's their ego that's forming the education.
Yeah, also when observing the way that parents relate to children, it's not really essentially different from his era, but we are trying to be more permissive. But when it comes to all issues, sexuality, the customary solution always is to try to provide some kind of silly notion about it, or just squiggle around without really. I mean, this idea of mystery making, Freud is really on point when he says that perhaps the reasons for this is kind of like maybe the bad conscience of the parents about issues of sexuality. We cannot really think about them straight. But maybe this is when what we are reading here is Freud is really revolutionizing the very notion of sexuality by just really observing the people who are having mental troubles. So there is a tendency to try and think that his observations only apply to the kind of unhealthy mind. But what we are observing when reading these texts is a revolutionizing in very concept of sexuality, since we need to also in ourselves, when we are thinking about all our own past, recognize that there is always distortions and cuts, and there are, I mean, it's Christmas holidays, what a disappointment and so on. But yeah, when simply walking around the childhood neighborhood, I was reminded all the time about the sexual frustrations growing up and being a kid. So I think that this is not something that's peculiar to me, that in growing up there is this kind of, as you said, the fantasies that are formed during like normal adulthood, growing up as a normal person. There is these kind of fantasies which are informed by our very infantile ideas that are sort of like a material that's accumulated in very early years. So I think that the kind of like idea that came to me when I was reflecting on my early like experiences of having the first girlfriend, it was this kind of idea that this should in a way continue forever. This should be eternal.
Yes.
And the fact that, as always is the case, it gets obstructed, the love relation. It always messes up things. And then after you create the kind of excessive like fantasy, the hysterical fantasy, which Freud talks about here, and after having created that fantasy, you kind of always return to those original scenes. And there is this idea of, I mean, it's the infantile idea par excellence that it should go on forever. It is for eternity. There are no boundaries for love and so on.
Yeah.
And they get changed into spiritual traditions, so to say.
Yeah,
also.
yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and even to the point where in the next paper, I don't want to jump too far ahead into the next paper, but even to the next paper where they're basically saying that the problem with the religious priest is that they have this view of the immortal soul, which has the foundation for the moral precepts, but that is all built out of an infantile sexual wish.
Yeah.
You know, like you're saying,
yeah.
this eternal, that it should go on forever.
Yeah, I would like to also jump a bit ahead also and substantiate my claim that this is revolutionizing some concept of sexuality. So basically, the early part of Freud's career, he is developing a theory of sexuality, which has this kind of seduction hypothesis that the traumatic impact of sexuality is some external threat which comes and then disturbs the mind. Yeah. So this gets turned around, and the way that Zizek, for example, characterizes this shift is, he says that it's analogous to the way that Einstein formulated his theory of gravity. Is that at first some kind of like at first it is the object which is the cause of the curvature of the space, but then afterwards the picture is kind of the same, but the view towards it shifts around, and you do not perceive the object or the excessive element as the cause, but actually the cause is the inner kind of like predisposition within the subject, which causes the traumatic impact. And I think that this is really crucial idea, and it's something that's not really explicitly reflected by Freud here, but we can in a way see it as happening here.
Absolutely. It's in this shift from the sort of external event, the accidental external event happening to the subject versus the subject's own curvature, you could say. You know, the subject's own twist.
Yeah, and I prefer the term predisposition for being like, for becoming neurotic. So he's saying that it's our like reaction towards the events. I mean, it is inevitable that we encounter sexuality, and it is traumatic for everybody, but it's really how you react to it. What's your predisposition for it?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think this philosophical observation by Zizek is also something that fascinates me a great deal. You know, the idea that there is no, you know, and it's actually homologous here to what Freud basically concludes in this paper is, you know, saying, you know, Zizek's point about the general relativity is that it's not, there is no flat space where space gets curved from. It's, you know, space is inherently curved. If you have space, it's because there's already a curvature. Whereas here he's sort of Freud's making the same sort of statement in some sense vis-a-vis neurotics and healthy people. There is no, as it were, flat, healthy person, you know, nor everyone's sort of a neurotic curve. Just depends on how curved. I think it's fantastic. Is there anyone else who has questions or ideas about this first paper? Because it's super dense. I think there's a lot there. I think there is some things worth talking about deeper.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just still lost about perversions versus neuroses, because okay, I guess we can say that children are not neurotic. At least in general, they are not.
That's right. Well,
that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Isn't that the idea of Oedipal, like Oedipal scene? I mean, the child doesn't really encounter the Oedipal scene before some, I don't know, 5 years or something.
Wasn't it 1 year that the phallic intrusion comes? That's what I heard Bart say.
This is really developmental psychology, and I'm not expert.
Okay, because you know, I have this Nazi experiment which comes to my mind that, you know, you get a child and you don't let it become neurotic, you know, so you organize its environment in this way so that it won't become neurotic. But I guess that we as humans, we have to be neurotic to even reproduce, and that's the whole
Yeah,
point of
also
it.
it relates to the way that children are introduced to language, and it's the formation of memory also. It's that's issue here.
And I think also the you know, seeing neuroses as only bad or only as quote unquote mental illness is also kind of a problem, because it's not like perversion is a solution. And I think that's what our culture is understanding now. Like just maintaining perversion forever is actually it's empty. I don't know.
Yeah.
I could be wrong. I could be wrong. But
Yeah, no, it's interesting. What is this like in regards to death drive and libido, right? Because our culture is totally into like death and nostalgia and these all kind of dreams of the infantile state. So yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I think it has to be, I think perversion and neurosis to me have to be understood as a dialectical process in relationship to the subject's own capacity to, I don't know if the right word is exist well, or to exist in a way that it feels some flow with its sexual energy, or I don't know what the right words are, but some,
You know, fit for existence, the
yeah,
term
fit for
before.
existence. Yeah, fit for existence might be a good enough term. But just that it's clear to me anyway, the extremes of neurosis and the extremes of perversion are not in themselves a solution for anyone, and that it has to be some sort of dialectical mediation or process of these extremes. I mean, and it's there's definitely no like one word or one notion or something that solves the problem. There is no solution other
Yeah,
than,
that is the problem.
yeah, it's a process.
Yeah, yeah. It's the problem to think that. It's typical obsessional neurosis for this like
Yeah,
state of consciousness to come, like you talked about.
yeah. I mean, to enjoy, like, I guess the signifier that comes up in the philosophical tradition of like Zizek and Zupančić and Dollar is enjoy your symptom. Like that's sort of my symptom as a process, and to enjoy that process, you know, and that it's an intellectually rich process. It's an intellectual, it's an inherent part of your self-discovery. I don't know if I'm speaking personally now in some sense. You know, it's rich. It's a rich part of my intellectual life to accept this process, to be interested in it, to investigate it, to, you know, to reflect on the contradictions I encountered in extreme neuroses and the contradictions I encounter in extreme perversion, and to see what I'm to do with these contradictions. Maybe not the perfect answer, but that is, I think that's the point, is there is no perfect answer here. Yeah, but there does seem to be some interesting, I don't know if telos is the right word, but there does seem to be a developmental telos from perversion to neuroses, which involves negation. But it seems to be something that's not handled in an artful way. Like, I feel like we could be much more graceful or enlightened, and I guess that leads into the next paper, but much more enlightened about the way we handle this process.
To come to this issue by a side issue here, when Freud is in this paper sort of relinquishing his seduction theory of neurosis, he's also doing something quite really remarkable. He's recognizing that there is some kind of fantasy formation at the core of the neurotic symptom. I think that there is a good quote here. Freud says that anyone who knows how to interpret the language of hysteria will recognize that the neurosis is concerned only with the patient's repressed sexuality. And in this connection, he's saying that even the most complicated symptom shows itself to be representing or perhaps signifying by means of conversion fantasy some kind of sexual consent. So earlier he was thinking that there must be some kind of memory or some real event which is brought to mind, but now he's really, I think that he is taking seriously the fact that we have a capacity for forming fantasies, and he's saying that fantasy becomes sort of like written into the texture of the symptom. So so the role of fantasy is really crucial. I mean, when we are taking issue with neurosis in itself, it's always approached through some kind of fantasy for us, even when we are trying to be really objective. And I mean, is the issue then, if we are trying to explain neurosis, that we are trying to sort of step out of neurosis in explaining it, whereas when we are in a Hegelian manner, I would say perhaps really immersed in the phenomenon, we are also all the time producing some kind of fantasy about a situation where we do not have neurosis, some kind of free or non-castrated state where we are in possession of like eternal or the holy or the whatever. I mean, is the problem then that we have to approach hysteria and neurosis overall through being ourselves sort of already immersed in neurosis, and there is no kind of like neutral ground for saying what's the relation of perversion and what's neurosis and whatever. This also brings to mind a good quote from Zizek. I say that Zizek says that the trauma of excessively enjoying father who must be betrayed is at the very root of neurosis. Neurosis always involves a perturbed traumatic relationship to the father. In neurosis, the sublation of father enjoyment into the paternal name fails. So here comes the negative part. The figure of the father remains always marked with a traumatic stain of jouissance or some kind of enjoyment. And one of the traumatic scenes which brings such a distasteful jouissance to the neurotic is the scene of the father either being caught with his pants down or an obscene enjoyment which is being caused by seeing the father humiliated. So, yeah.
I love it.
I think that this is really a good way of formalizing the structure of neurosis. There is no kind of neutral way of approaching to it, and we cannot just ask plainly that, oh, what's neurosis, what is not. And
I just want to say that what the quote you gave there from Zizek, and I can observe that structure in my own mind. I just want to say that one of the main reasons I don't trust Jung is because I feel like he was doing that to Freud. And I know that in my own consciousness, when I'm trying to do that to an intellectual, someone who's intellectually higher than me or something, that I don't trust my own consciousness in doing this, you know, like my own attempt to kill the father type of thing. You know, this, I don't trust this in myself. I think that it's extremely difficult to deal with this. It's also the way Zizek depicts Jesus on the cross, Father, don't you see I'm burning, or, where are you, type of thing.
Yeah, and also it's really, I think that this is connected to it also. You had a really nice remark or jab at the way that normal so-called healthy relationships work. I mean, it's really a commonplace, but it's not something that one can discuss about really. I mean, there is no place to say this in a neutral way, but it really does repeat the kind of infantile situations where one is first experiencing oneself as a baby towards the mother, or the woman is experiencing herself as somebody who is related to her father, who either needs to be humiliated or being caught with pants down. And the way that I relate to the Freud quote about language of hysteria here, I think that it's something that might make a married man quite embarrassed to hear also these kind of issues. And I mean, I've experienced many times the kind of situation where I am perceived as the kind of like father enjoyment, the excessive element that needs to be sort of deprived of the malevolent elements and made into civilized form. When I observe old people, for example, outside walking, it's usually the pattern where the old woman is trying to sort of like make the excessively enjoying man into a more civilized, or deprive of the stop eating too much butter or whatever, too much salt. It's usually too much salt or something.
It's fantastic, man. It's fantastic. I observe that all the time, and I've also been the recipient of such civilizing.
Yeah, but it's so embarrassing.
Civilizing demands.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this way in which the man's enjoyment is seen as excessive, and needs to be constrained. Needs to be constrained, railed in, and the archetype is like the like the woman who gets it, like who wants to be the one that tames him. Like there's a beast, there's a wild beast that she alone, her touch can tame. And the paradox is for the woman is that if she tames this, if this beast is tamed, then does her own sexual fantasy dissolve? Like now I've just got this tamed thing here.
Yeah.
I didn't actually want that. I just wanted the process of taming something excessive.
Yeah, it's so funny.
Again, we have to handle all these things dialectically with all their contradictions as as we explore, our identity dissolves. As the thing we want, when we get the thing we want, our identity dissolves. There's never this symmetry of identity with what it wants. You think you want something, you get it, all of a sudden it changes and you want something different. There's a parallax shift always. Anyway,
Yeah.
Unless there's any more points, I'm going to go to the next paper. Does anyone want to make any final points or final questions about this paper? We can also revisit it in context of the next paper. All right. I'm going to share my screen again. So on to the next paper, Sexual Enlightenment of Children. This is much shorter. It's going to be very brief, but I think it's to the point, and I think it will capture a pretty interesting conversation. So again, he rehashes here that for his view, what psychoanalysis discovers is that any harm to sexual development and any harm to sexual development and function is the most important cause of neurotic disorder. So basically, he's asking himself in this paper, what is the consequence of this for sexual education? So now that we know that our mental illnesses, our mental disorders have some sort of relationship to the way our sexual energy has been developed and functioned, how and when should children be given what he calls, quote unquote, sexual enlightenment, which for Freud is basically the truth about sexual nature and the truth about sex in society. So there's two dimensions of it. Now, Freud's claim here, and this is in the context of his society, is that the adults engage in what he calls prudish concealment. So they're prudes. And he defines this prudish concealment as the desire to make up mysteries about sexuality in front of children instead of just telling them the truth of sexuality. So he even gives examples of the stork, you know, telling children that where babies come from is a stork brings the baby. This is the mystery making instead of the just telling the truth about it. So he does admit that part of it could be theoretical ignorance, but he attributes most of it to a prudish attitude. It's, in other words, it's a subjective disposition more so than a intellectual ignorance or a theoretical. In other words, he's saying adults know damn well where babies come from, but they're just prudes about admitting where babies come from. So next slide. Freud's claim here, and this he gets into a lot of trouble for emphasizing infantile sexuality, is he says newborn babies bring sexuality into the world just through their suckling, that it's erotic stimulation of the genitals, the skin, the mouth, again, the polymorphous perverse body, is just unavoidable. It's our nature. He also says that children gain two capacities which he sees as important, which is first, they gain the capacity for love tenderness. And I love the way he frames this. He says love tenderness is the gain of the capacity to show devotion to the other and to be jealous of the other. And I think that this is really what is at play when it comes to the social nature of our sexuality, is what do we do with the emotion, our capacity for extreme devotion to another and extreme jealousy for the other? How do we deal with this? Plus that children gain the capacity of curiosity for the origin of babies, or ultimately what it's about is the origin of myself. Where do I come from? And this can't be interpreted in a evolutionary way, like, oh, you come from apes, you evolved from the animals. No, it's about the origin of myself. So he defines sexual enlightenment as gaining the intellectual grasp on the truth of sexuality. So it's bringing the, and this is so crucial to understanding psychoanalysis and the importance of psychoanalysis vis-a-vis philosophy, science, or other forms of knowledge. It's about bringing the intellect into an acceptance of our sexual truth, as opposed to using the intellect as a defense against our sexual truth, which you would say the other knowledges mostly do. So he claims that when adults lie, distort, make myths, or intimidate, he says intimidate with religion, intimidate about the truth of sexuality, that this creates inner torment. So in some sense, he's saying that, you know, he's in a fancy way, he's saying the truth will set you free. That if you just accept the truth and we just speak clearly and truthfully about it, we can reduce a lot of the inner torment that we feel around these things, which are created by unnecessary lies, distortions, myths, and intimidation. And here's the final slide. He says, the problem is that sexual knowledge is kept from children. and that the solution is to stop making secrets about it, to treat it like any other subject. So by treating sexuality as if it's something different than talking about anything else, we make too much about it. That if from the very beginning, we just treat sexuality as we treat any other topic, then perhaps there could be a more dialectical relationship with the process of sexuality itself. So the two steps that he recommends for sexual enlightenment, and he literally says that, you know, a child at the age of 10, you know, he's saying this strategically because he thinks the child should know the truth about this before they reach the genital stage of puberty development. He thinks they should know two things. He thinks they should know that we share sexual energy with the animals, just like the animals have sex and reproduce themselves through sexual energy, so do we. There's a continuity here. The second thing he thinks they need to know is that the way you express your sexuality has a very high social significance. In other words, it's not just like any other activity in that regard, that how you have sex has a high level of social significance. And then he makes a critique on religion. He says that the religious people will not admit human-animal continuity, which is, again, the evolutionary hypothesis, which is that we come from the animal and we're sexual just like the animals are. And he says that the religious defense is that we have an immortal soul, which is pure. This is crucial, that they're prudish because they believe they're pure. So I think that there's a difference between the purity view and the pathos view, that you can't understand the truth of pathos if you think you're just this pure immortal soul as the core of your morality. And of course, Nietzsche critiqued the morality as well. This is why Freud naturally emerges out of Nietzschean philosophy, and why it's important if you're just starting to get into psychoanalysis, it's good to read Nietzsche as a preface to the psychoanalytic moment, because Nietzsche's critiquing all this stuff. But I would like to inject the idea that what Freud misses in some sense in regards to our current moment, which again, I would argue is more in this sexual permissiveness culture, but the sexual permissiveness is so low level consciousness. In other words, we're permissive, but we're permissive as a defense against this. We're still, in other words, we were neurotic against the truth, and then we're permissive against the truth. But we can't just be with the truth dialectically as a process. I think that's so important. Like, and if the religion was the problem before, with the purity and the immortal soul and stuff, and so I can't be a sexual being in my core because I'm a pure immortal being, then to me, now the problem is more it's not the continuity with animals that's the problem. It's the, what do we do with sex socially? In other words, it's the problem of communism. It's not the problem of religion, it's the problem of communism. We can't do communism because the sexuality gets in the way. And we don't know how to deal with it dialectically. We don't know how to deal with it, you know, in social significance of it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but it's a shorter paper, but really I think a good one for discussion. And you know, by all means, you know, take liberty. I'm taking liberties here with my interpretation of some of these texts because I want to bring it to the importance of thinking our present moment.
I could add on to that one. That just reminds me, like, just like how he defines ideology nowadays is different in that we know like what we're doing, but we still go on doing it anyways. And going back to that permissive culture, it's like we know, like since we're kids now and we have internet and all that, you can find out at an early age, even though we know that this is the case, we don't structure our relationships based on that knowledge. So it's kind of like on the first date, you still pretend like, oh, this is not about sex. I'm just trying to get to know you. I feel like that in a same way as like the ideological permissiveness of nowadays, it's like, you know, but you're not willing to actually define your actions in your life around that new knowledge. If you kind of like understand what I'm saying there.
That's good, yeah. So there is a kind of a structural blindness, even though we are really enlightened. As well, I think that maybe Zizek does capture this from Peter Sloterdijk, who wrote the Critique of Cynical Reason, and here Sloterdijk is arguing that we today are kind of like enlightened about everything, but still contain really too much cuts and distortions in our lives to really live like Nietzschean lives. But yeah, I think that I would also like to add on to the list here. I mean, Freud is definitely identifying the main reason for this kind of mystery making as the overly prudish attitude and the kind of holier than thou attitude, but also he's saying that there are two other factors, and I would say that they are more crucial and perhaps more psychoanalytic reasons for why this is going on. So this is already discussed by Jacob earlier in an earlier comment, that there's this kind of structural blindness. So when one is observing life of children, it's really obvious there are sexual things going on, but there's some kind of structural blindness to it going on all the time. I mean, it might be that there are some reasons why it feels bad for the adult to see it or talk about it, but Freud is also saying that there might be this bad conscience of the father or the mother. They might themselves feel bad for having sexual experiences, and they are brought to mind in the forms of neurotic symptoms or as fantasies. So it might be that there are two perhaps primary reasons for not discussing sexuality, which are connected to the way that our own psyche is structurally blind to things which would disturb us.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's why that would be my guess for what causes the prudishness. It's a reflection of their own repression of that I have these feelings as well. It's the capacity to be vulnerable. So you defend your, like, with the idea that I am at my core an immortal soul, it prevents you from being vulnerable. Like, actually in my core, I'm just this, I feel this, I'm this lacking entity. I don't know what to do with myself. I don't know.
Isn't this like the problem of Cartesianism? Sorry to interrupt you.
No, go for it.
Like that it's not as, we're not sexual and we're not sexuated in the immortal soul ideology.
Yes.
It's like we're this pure, immaterial, whatever being outside of this dirty material reality.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
but
yeah,
Descartes doesn't think that way. Descartes doesn't think that we are really disconnected souls.
Okay, now that's true, but I would say it in a way that, it's I would agree with Bart here that this is the kind of religion that if you don't have, I'm kind of paraphrasing him, that if we don't have a religion in society, the religion is just going to be the ego itself, Like here in the Netherlands, we are very atheistic, and if you ask people like, what do you believe in? They're like, or like, do you believe in God? They're like, no, I believe in myself. And it's like a joke, but it's literally true. Like that, it's the ego who's just thinking it's a God itself, So yeah. But Mika, yeah, you're free to like critique me.
Yeah. I mean, Descartes has this example of, I mean, the problem in Descartes is that we are not detached souls. Really, it's a similar problem. Well, he's explaining in his meditations that the way that we observe our own bodies is not the same way as a captain would or a sailor would observe a ship that he or she is on. It's not the same. So this is the problem of Descartes, that why are we not the kind of detached souls? that's the pure thinking sort of says that we are. I mean, he has a real distinction, which is the most famous part of his whole philosophy. But basically, Descartes is really like, his moral philosophy is really concerned about affects, about how they appear as the kind of intermingling of the mental and the physical. That's the side issue, I think so. So
yeah, I think that the Christian immortal soul ideology is more the foundation for that. I've always thought is Plato. I always thought the foundation of the monotheist traditions is most closely related to Plato's idea of the eternal ideas.
Yeah, it's definitely it's quite widely recognized in philosophy. I mean, history of philosophy, that there is some continuity in Plato to later Christianism, and it goes through the kind of transformation of Neoplatonism from Plotinus, who is really, I think, just Plato but more crazier. But it's really enjoyable to read also, since he's so explicit about his thesis. And yeah, but there is the idea of like there being an inner kind of detached or pure soul in us. It's something that Plato does think that there is, but yeah.
I read that there is no immortal soul in the Bible. Is that right?
Anyone who has a special knowledge of that? Apparently not. I'm not. What have you read, Ishik?
It says, who says the spirit for human goes upwards and the spirit of animals downwards? Who is to say that in the Bible? There's something about that. So there is no immortal soul in the Bible.
That's really interesting. But perhaps the kind of ideology that surrounds Christianity, it builds on the idea of there being some kind of immortal soul.
I mean, when I hear Christians talk about their thesis on the soul, I mean, when I think about all the Christians, like the real Christians that I've had conversations with about this topic, they all presuppose an immortal soul. I don't know where the connection is in the Bible, but because I haven't studied the Bible deeply enough to answer that. But definitely the Christians I've talked to presuppose that. I'm sure it would be very interesting to see what passages that Christians use to support that. I mean, I'm sure if we had an expert in the group, I'm sure they'd be able to enlighten us on this. I just think it's interesting the context in which Freud is situating his sexual enlightenment of children. Like it's all about the prudishness about it. It's all about the inability of the ego to confront the truth. And I think that today we still have the same issue, like, because kids are now, but it's different. Kids today are being exposed to sexuality at an early age through the internet. And we still have the same problem that adults are struggling to broach the topic with them, which I think is necessary. I think that it has to be the next stage of our society, that children get calm, stoic truth before they reach puberty, and that they feel that they can talk about any sexual problems that might come up in their development openly with parental figures that they care and that they feel safe with. To me,
exactly, that's right on point.
To me, that would be the solution. Like that I'm just thinking about how would I do it if I was a parent. How I would do it is I would take what Freud's basically saying to treat sexuality just like I would treat anything else worth knowing about, like education, economics, politics, whatever, and have age-appropriate conversations with the child as they're developing, and pay special close attention when they're turning 10 and 11, because they're going to come into a new phase of their sexual energy, and I want them to feel open talking to me about that as they go through it. And that doesn't mean it doesn't mean sorry?
I mean, isn't it something like this Santa Claus joke that Zizek tells? Like the child knows very well that Santa Claus doesn't exist, but pretends that it does exist in order to make their parents happy. So same goes with the permissive society. Now with the internet, kids know very well how a child is brought to life, but yet still they pretend that they don't know it. So I think same thing goes for the sexuality as well. Again, as you said, they cannot. Yeah.
Evan, let me just say that although Freud is emphasizing the mystery making around the origin of the babies, I think that today, the more the mystery making is over the social significance of sexuality. Like that, how you use your sexuality as a teenager, how you use your sexuality as an adult, it matters a lot.
Definitely agree with that. Yeah.
So it's less that there's a mystery making over where do babies come from. It's more a mystery making over actually sexuality is fundamental for how we exist as adults. And I think adults don't talk about that because they themselves are acting like idiots, or they themselves are acting unconsciously. So they mystery make about that maybe now today.
So how open should we be to children about sexuality? Like, I totally agree with you that we should kind of demystify it and talk about it in an open way. So if they feel certain things, they can express it. Like, you know, adults now really can't, and have a lot of problems with it. But on the other hand, I heard Alexander Bart say that, you know, you don't want to have children experience pathos. Like, you don't want children to experience, you know, trauma, and sexuality is very traumatic. Even to adults, it's a kind of shortcut, like Alenka Zupancic talks about. It's deeply pathic in this sense. So yeah, what is to be done there?
Well, what the quote I have, you said Bard says you don't want to have children experience pathos. It's not about experiencing pathos. It's about making the child feel like there's not this sharp boundary on my speech when it comes to the issue of sexuality. So like, for example, that I feel like, for example, if I say for example, I don't just that I feel that with my primary caregivers, I don't have to silence myself around this issue particularly. Like that I can speak about it. Like it's not that I have to, not that you want to sexualize your children. That's the opposite, like the opposite form of, you know, the opposite of the prudish parent today with the permissive parent is the parent who over sexualizes their child in some unconscious way. But it's not about that either. It's just about we can talk maturely at age appropriate levels. Like that you can talk to me about this. It doesn't have to be some weird censored thing. Am I making sense?
But
Yeah,
but don't they have to be aware of different aspects of it then? Because they're gonna ask the children questions like, okay, show me, or like, but what then? And then, you know, how does it function? Oh, you know, like, you know, all those direct questions. So they're gonna discover that there's some deep shortcut, that there's some weird ass shit where, you know, the shortcut. I don't know.
Yeah. Also, well, I don't think that we are really in certain aspects different from Freud's era, since I think that the children at that era must have encountered sexuality in different ways, but what's different is the media behavior that we today exert to ourselves in having all kinds of gadgets. And I can remember like encountering hardcore pornography and videos of beheadings and all kinds of stuff, also without doing sexuality, which were too traumatic for the kind of age that I were in. So we have to recognize the fact that when children have iPhones in their hands, I mean, they are going to see pornography, hardcore stuff. It's going to be eventual, but the kind of mystery making about where the babies come from, it's kind of these kind of silly soft issues that are going to be the same as in Freud's era, but what is different is the kind of content that they are going to be faced with. And we have to be really more mature about sexuality than ever before if we are going to have children. And
Yes.
yeah,
I think
I think that I would like to also, on the previous discussion about the issue of what kind of sexuality, I mean, I don't think that the problem is sex itself, really. The problem is our own repression that we have built towards it. And I think maybe on some interpretation, perhaps mine, that the fundamental kind of thesis of what Lacan teaches is that the kind of swerving of the space around issues of sexuality is fundamental, and we cannot really approach sexuality without this kind of like internalized repression. And some kind of thesis that I would perhaps like to come up with is that maybe our whole society or our whole world is kind of, or reality is kind of built around repression of sexuality in a way, since if you are going to talk about sexuality openly, you are a threat to society. I mean, Freud is even today perceived as a threat to civilized normal psychology and the self-understanding of human beings. And it's not really the sex which is the issue, it's the repression, and how much of this repression is like normal, how much is it excessive, how are you experiencing your life, and so on. We need to talk about things, you know. I mean, I think I might risk a hypothesis that unless you have some kind of resistance or internalized like repression of sexuality, you're not really normal person, and then you would not be a really good authority to hear about sexuality. I mean, a kid who is seeing some kind of hardcore pornography on iPhone, you're not really able to teach that children anything if you are wholly free from every kind of resistance, is completely permissive, the kind of ideal. So yeah, to repeat my point, I think that the problem is not with the thing itself, but its problem is really in the repression and denials and all kinds of distortions that come up with us when we discuss these things.
I think hopefully building on that point, for me, simply as I perceive the current landscape and the social significance of sexuality, is that if kids are seeing hardcore stuff online and they don't have anyone to talk to about what they're seeing, or they don't have any adult they can trust to talk about these issues, then I think what they miss is that the actual reality of sexuality is that, and its social significance, is that we experience huge amounts of devotion and jealousy around sexuality, that it's a cornerstone for our social existence and our social lives, and the feelings we get around sexuality related to devotion and jealousy are things that are probably going to have a bigger impact on us psychologically throughout our development than anything else. And we need to have older people that can help us guide through that process.
Well, yeah, and we need philosophers like Subhanshis and Zizek.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, well, I would like to also connect the kind of common wisdom which says, I mean, this came up during Christmas when discussing with older people, that isn't the psychoanalytic idea that everything is basically sexualized, everything is sex. Isn't this the kind of like really the wisdom of psychoanalysis? No, it's not that. I mean, the way that Zizek says it, the main problem is that what are we thinking when we are doing really sex? What's at that point, what is on our mind? And what's really the topic here is fantasy. What kind of fantasy formations do we require to be able to encounter sexuality?
Yep.
It's not some kind of like, I'm going to take a really non-partial approach, just discuss it as a whole and purely objectively and so on. You're already approaching the issue through your own fantasy. And Zizek has this fun, really connecting funny statement. It's not the children really, but the adults who need to be sexually educated.
Yep.
I mean it's the adult who needs sexual education, since we have to form our sexual lives around some kind of like structures and some kind of like symbolic places and so on. It's really an issue that we cannot ever really get full satisfaction out of. But the kind of like traditional view that's about sexuality that comes to my mind is some kind of like yogic abstinence of sexuality. I mean, the way that some like yogic systems approach to sexuality is just to say that it needs to be repressed, put into right place, and then you can experience the supreme enlightenment and so on. So basically, when people are trying to be yogic and trying to like have normal lives, the advice is to have some kind of like breathing exercise during the sex, so that you don't fully immerse yourself into the kind of emptiness or the void or whatever is experienced after sex. I mean, every culture seems to have some kind of like, from ancient on, from very early on, it's always about sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Another question is how enlightenment turns into wokeness.
Sorry, how enlightenment turns into wokeness.
Yeah,
Can you expand on that?
you know, instead of prudishness, you
Mhm.
have the figure of bigots to be cancelled.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I do experience the woke people to be a weird form of prudishness in in some way. I do suspect, and I've sort of run this by a few people now, is that I do think that the woke people are in a weird way struggling with accepting their pathos. And I even think that there are paradoxes of their wokeness, their ideology, and their sexual activity, which are quite funny sometimes. Like the one that comes to mind, the most obvious that came up, was that Asian woman New York Times reporter who was tweeting about how much she hates white guys, and at the same time is dating white guys. This type of thing is very present in the woke people.
Definitely, yeah. And one kind of example of this comes to mind. I mean, I know some kind of really woke like circles around the Helsinki techno scene. I mean, they are really like trying to be all encompassing, permissive about everything. Everything is like, you are included, everything. So what happens? I mean, they should have given me €5 and told me to predict what happens. I mean, I could have said it just hearing what their ideology espouse. What happens is that there comes some kind of like really perverted guy or some master pervert who really starts to harass girls and do everything. And the woke people who are permissive, they can't do a shit about it.
Mm.
I mean, it's what happens in every kind of like spiritual circles where they're trying to free themselves to full enlightenment, blah, blah, blah. What happens is somebody tries to grab all the assets and it gets into a problem, and
Yeah,
it's the same pattern always.
It's the general problem of tolerance, is that if you tolerate everything, someone's going to come and run over you.
Yeah, and they cannot do anything about it anymore. I mean,
Yeah.
they have somebody who broke every explicit rule that they have on the book. I mean, they cannot do anything about it.
Yeah, they need to understand the antinomies of reason, because if you like, let's be totally free, and then they find themselves in slavery. You know, let's like, it's the same thing with like people who are like overly let's be totally rational, and then you find yourself in irrationality. Like they just don't understand the antinomies. Like you got to just work with them. There's no, what I had said in a conversation with a guy last week was, or what we came to is, you can't, like, and this is, I think Deleuze is to blame for this on some level. You can't get out of dialectics. You have to go through dialectics. You have to move through and with the dialectic. If you try to escape the dialectic, you're just going to find yourself as a contradictory mess. You know, I mean, everyone has their own relationship with how they're going to go through the dialectic, but
yeah, this is also related to the joke that Freud quotes elsewhere. That's I don't know if I'm going to bungle up the joke, but yeah, it goes like, what's the pathway from sublime to the ridiculous? Well, it's the canal of Kala. What is between? I mean, I'm sorry, I don't remember the name, but the canal between France and Britain. It's a short canal, but the idea is dialectical twist that all kind of sublime really turns into ridiculous in a really short step. It's really the shortest step of all is from like the highest of highest, holiest towards the lowest scum always.
yeah, I think Terence McKenna always said, made the distinction between shit and shinola. It's a short step from shit to shinola. It is, or like in Hegel's dialectic, the coincidence between the highest and the lowest. Yeah, super interesting. Freud is I think so much more Hegelian than well, obviously he had no idea how Hegelian he was.
Yeah.
It's so funny. I mean, because he in some sense he you know, Freud finds the highest and the lowest, you know. Like.
Yeah, and I think in a sense, I could say that both of them are similar in that they are not adopting uncritically the kind of traditional master position. That's the kind of like they are really authorities on issues, but they don't really recognize themselves as some kind of traditional master, who's just as some kind of like yogic master would give to the brahmacharya the you need to do this, you need to do that.
Yeah.
So they are not adopting that kind of position. They are fully modern in that sense.
Yeah. Does anyone have any other major points or questions that they want to bring up over the sexual enlightenment of children? No major questions. If not, I'm gonna maybe do a little summary and wrap up.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay. So again, to recap what we've covered here in this workshop is, I think, a demonstration of, you know, when someone really discovers something and they're really interested in the truth of something, they're constantly revising their ontology, constantly updating it. It's never static and fixed, but something that's constantly being informed by new experience. And I think you see that in the first paper we covered by Freud, where basically he comes to the revision idea that our sexuality is built out of infantile memories, our sexual fantasies, our capacity to engage in sex, our capacity to be adult, you know, sexually active as adults, is the capacity to take these very infantile memories and transform them in the genital phase, and then also that the main cause of the neuroses doesn't necessarily have things to do with the events in themselves, but the way in which the ego defense is operating in the subject. Primarily here related to the denial or the acceptance of negative affect. So to think about that is, when you're thinking about those things, is to think about what are my sexual fantasies built out of, when you look at your own sexual fantasies. And the other thing is to think about how you as an individual, deal with negative affect, the denial or the acceptance of such, and how is your identity a response or a construction from dealing with this negative affect or not. I think that those were two of the main things I took away from the first paper. And then in the sexual enlightenment of children, I think we see that Freud here is reacting to an over moralization of sexuality, and he's looking for a way in which we can bring this truth of sexuality into a developmental lens. How would we handle this pedagogically? How would we handle this as responsible, mature adults? And I think today, I think that we've swung on the pendulum from one end to the other, from prudishness to permissiveness, you might say. And all of it is an ego defense against just dealing with the truth as a process. So it's a lot to think about, but I think for me, what I'm taking away is, I really want to, create an intellectual culture which can work with the sexual energy in a mature, responsible way as a process, as opposed to, just maintaining a certain illusion which can't deal with negative affect. Basically, that's how I perceive it, is to, and a lot of I feel like in my own work in other fields, I really feel like a lot of the mental health crisis is a perspective shift on negative affect, and accepting that we have negative affect, and learning how to be mature and work with negative affect instead of repressing it and denying it, in all of the many deceptive ways we can do that. So thank you guys, thank you everyone for joining me. If you are already on the email list, I send out an email for the next workshop. If you're not on the email list, message me, I can add you to it. And other than that, I will see everyone in our next workshop, hopefully in 2 weeks. So thank you all for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for organizing.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.